She was 25 and out of teaching when she answered a call from a 507 area code she did not recognize on a Thursday in late October, sitting in the parking lot of a Minneapolis elementary school she had walked out of 4 months earlier in the middle of a school year. She had $140 in checking and a car she still owed money on. The man on the line said the township had an old one-room schoolhouse registered against her grandmother's homestead claim, and it could go to her for $1 and the back taxes if she came down to Wyndham and signed. He meant a real building, frame 1888, 16 by 24 feet, on a section line in Cottonwood County. But what nobody knew was that under the teacher's desk, in a hinged panel in the floor that the last teacher had closed in 1949, was a register and a sealed letter that would change how Nora Whitfield understood every classroom she had ever stood in. If stories like this one mean something to you, take a second and subscribe and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We like seeing how far these stories travel. Nora Whitfield had been moving toward that schoolhouse for most of her life without knowing the building existed. She grew up in a third-ring suburb north of the Twin Cities, the kind of place engineered in 1971 with curved streets named after trees that had been bulldozed to build it. Her mother sold insurance. Her father installed commercial flooring and was gone a lot, and then was gone for good when Nora was 14. Not dramatically, just the slow way some fathers leave. A smaller and smaller presence until the chair at the table was simply empty and no one mentioned it. What she had, in place of a steady house, was her grandmother. Every summer from the time she was 6 until she was about 15, Nora was put on a bus or in the back of somebody's car and sent down to Wyndham, in the southwestern corner of the state, where her grandmother lived in a narrow white house 2 blocks from the Des Moines River. Her grandmother's name was Ingrid. She had taught school. Not in a city, and not in a modern building with a gymnasium and a cafeteria, but in a country school, a single room with a single stove, near a town called Westbrook, in the autumn of 1961, the year before the district consolidated and the country schools were closed one after another like a row of windows going dark. Ingrid did not talk about it the way people talk about hardship. She talked about it the way people talk about good work. She told Nora about the morning fires, how you laid the kindling the night before so it would catch on the first match when your hands were too cold to fumble. She told her about the older boys who came late in October once the corn was in, and how you did not shame them for missing September because September belonged to the harvest and everyone in that country understood it. She told her about the recitation bench, a plain pine bench at the front of the room where 1 grade at a time came up to read aloud while the other 7 grades worked silently at their desks, and how the whole machine of a one-room school ran on that bench, on the trust that a 9-year-old would keep working on her sums while you listened to a 6-year-old sound out his letters. I want to tell you something about that kind of school because most people have it wrong, and I had it wrong too before I started looking. We imagine the one-room schoolhouse as a thing that ended a long time ago, a sepia photograph, gone by the time the automobile arrived. It is not true. In Minnesota, the last of the one-room country schools did not close until the late 1960s. My grandmother taught in one in 1961, when men were already orbiting the Earth, and the teacher in those rooms was very often younger than her oldest students. A girl of 19 with a 2-year normal school certificate, boarding with a local farm family for $18 a month, in charge of 40 children and 1 stove, and the whole of arithmetic and spelling and the geography of a world she had mostly never seen. That is the thing to hold on to, not a stern figure in spectacles. A young woman, often frightened, doing the work anyway. Nora kept some of her grandmother's seriousness about the work and almost none of her steadiness. She went to a state university, got a teaching license, and took a 3rd-grade position in a Minneapolis public school at 22, in a building with 1,100 students and a security buzzer at the front door. She was good at it. That is the part nobody believed later when she tried to explain why she left. She was good at it the way you can be good at something that is slowly taking you apart. 28 students in a room built for 22. a reading curriculum that changed every 18 months because a vendor in another state had a new contract. Parent emails at 11 at night. A boy named Marcus who could not read at 9 and whom she could not reach because there was no time. There was never any time. The day was a conveyor belt and the children rode past her on it and she could not get any of them to stop long enough to be taught. She made it 3.5 years. In February of her 4th year, she stood up in the middle of a Tuesday, told the aide she needed a minute, walked to her car, and did not go back inside. She finished out the week on paper, by phone, the way June Prescott's father might have finished a life, present in form and gone in fact. Then she resigned. She spent the spring and summer doing contract work that did not require her to care about anyone, scanning documents for a law office, and she told herself she was resting, and she was not resting. She was lying very still, the way an animal lies still when it has been hurt and does not yet know how badly. The call came in October. The man's name was Merle Albu, and he was the county recorder of Cottonwood County, and he had been the county recorder for 34 years, which meant he had outlived 3 sets of commissioners and the entire idea of a courthouse that closed for lunch. He had found Nora the way recorders find people, by following a quarter section back through 80 years of paper. The schoolhouse had been built in 1888 on a corner of land donated by a homesteader named Aun, and when the district consolidated in 1961, the building had reverted in a tangle of easements to the descendants of the original donors, and the descendants had let it sit, paying nothing, claiming nothing, until the township finally moved to take it for the back taxes. 1961, I should say. The county minutes have it as 61, though the deed transfer was not recorded until the following spring, which is why some of the family papers say 62. The discrepancy mattered briefly when the title was checked, and not at all afterward. Somewhere in that paper trail was Ingrid, and through Ingrid, Nora. "It's not worth anything," Merle told her on the phone, and I have come to understand that this was his way of being honest with her, so that she could not later say she had not been warned. The roof's bad. The stove may or may not be in it. The township would just as soon knock it down and stop mowing around it. But it's a real building, and your grandmother's name is on the easement, and I thought somebody in the family ought to get the chance to say no in person before it comes down. She drove south the next morning. The Twin Cities thinned out around Shakopee and then gave up entirely, and the land went flat and wide, and the sky came down to meet it. This is the part of Minnesota that people from the cities forget exists. The southwestern shoulder, the Buffalo Ridge country, where the Prairie starts and does not stop again until the Rockies. Cornfields shorn to stubble, soybean ground turned black, grain elevators standing at the rail sidings like the only tall things for miles, which is what they are. The wind came across the open ground from the west with nothing to break it, and Nora's small car shuddered in the gusts, and she gripped the wheel and watched the horizon fill the windshield and felt something in her chest she had not felt in a long time, which was the absence of a ceiling. Westbrook was a town of about 700 people built along a single rail line. A grain elevator, a cafe, a Lutheran church, a hardware store, and the kind of wide, empty main street that was built for the horse traffic of a century ago and has been too big ever since. Merle Albu met her not in Wyndham, but at the cafe in Westbrook, because he said the schoolhouse was 3 miles north and there was no sense her driving the courthouse twice. He was past 70, a tall, stooped man with a recorder's habit of precision, and he had a thermos of coffee and 2 cups, and he poured her one without asking, which I have learned is how the old men of that country decide whether you are worth their time. You take the coffee. You drink it black because that is how it comes. You do not complain about the cold because the cold is not a topic, it is a condition. You taught, he said. It was not a question. Somebody had told him. For a while. Country school? City, Minneapolis. He nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he is filing something away, rather than agreeing with it. Different animal, he said. Same animal, maybe. I don't know. I never taught. He turned his cup a quarter turn on the table. The woman who taught out there longest was named Iris Lundgren, 36 to 49. She'd be gone now, of course, but there's people in this town still remember being taught by her. That tells you something about a building. Most buildings, nobody remembers a thing that happened in them. They drove north out of town in 2 cars, Merle ahead in a county pickup, Nora behind, and the gravel road ran straight as a ruled line between 2 fields, and at the corner where the section lines crossed, set back from the road behind a windbreak of box elder gone wild, was the schoolhouse. It stood the way old things stand on the prairie, not placed there so much as left there. Frame construction, white once, weathered now to the grey of old bone, 16 feet wide and 24 feet long, with a steep roof built to shed the snow, and a small bell cupola at the front peak with no bell in it. The windows on the south wall were tall and many-paned, the way schoolhouse windows were, built to flood the room with light because there was no other light. And 3 of the panes were broken, and the rest were filmed grey with 30 years of dust. The front door faced east, away from the wind. Above it, carved into a board gone soft with rot, she could still read 2 words and a number. District 47, 1888. 16 by 24, Merle said, coming up beside her. They were all about that size. Bigger than you'd think inside, smaller than you'd think out here. He looked at it the way you look at something you have looked at 1,000 times and never quite finished looking at. Dollar and the back taxes. Comes to $410 even, with the township's mowing bill. You don't have to decide today. The wind held. Nora walked up the path through the dead grass, and the steps were soft at the edges and solid at the center, and they held her, and she crossed the small porch and put her hand on the door. The latch was a simple iron thumb latch, worn smooth by 10,000 hands, by every child who had ever come in out of the cold for 60 years, and she pressed it, and the door swung inward into the dim and the cold, and the smell of a place that has been closed a long time. Dust and old wood and chalk and the faint sweetness of decay. Inside was a single room. The afternoon light came through the south windows in long grey shafts, thick with floating dust. The desks were gone, most of them, sold or scrapped or hauled off by people who needed the wood. But the iron frames of a few were still bolted to the floor in their rows, small ones at the front for the little children, larger ones at the back. The recitation bench stood at the front, exactly where her grandmother had described it, a plain pine bench, worn pale in 2 spots where generations of children had sat. The stove was still there, against the side wall, a tall pot-bellied cast-iron stove with a name on its belly she could not read in the dim, the flue pipe rusted but still running up to the ceiling. And at the front of the room, on a low platform, facing all those empty rows, was the teacher's desk. It was oak, heavy, scarred, the kind of desk that is built once and lasts a century. The top was furred with dust. The drawers were swollen shut. And as Nora stood in the doorway of that cold room, with the light failing and the wind coming around the eaves with a low, steady sound like breathing, she had the distinct and unreasonable feeling that the room had been waiting. Not for anyone, for someone. For the next person who would come in and stand at the front and feel the weight of all those empty desks and understand what the bench was for. She did not know yet about the panel in the floor. She did not know about Iris Lundgren, or about the register, or about the name written in the margin of the spring of 1936 that I am going to tell you about. The name that I have now read with my own eyes in the brittle pages of that book, in the back room of the Cottonwood County Historical Society in Windham, on a Tuesday morning last spring, with Merle Albu's granddaughter standing beside me to turn the pages, because my hands are not careful enough. But she felt it, standing in the door. She felt that the room was not finished. She crossed it slowly, her footsteps loud on the board floor, and she went to the teacher's desk, and she put her hand flat on the dusty top, the way you put a hand on the shoulder of someone you have not yet met. And she stood there a long time, as the light went out of the south windows, and the cold came up through the floor, and somewhere under that floor, 8 inches beneath her feet, in a space lined with oilcloth and closed for 70 years, the thing that Iris Lundgren had left for whoever came next waited in the dark to be found. She signed for it 11 days later, and then the work began. And the work is where this kind of story actually lives, not in the signing. The first thing was the stove, because it was November now, and the nights were dropping below freezing, and you cannot work in a building you cannot heat. The stove was a pot-bellied cast-iron heater, and once she had wiped 60 years of dust off the belly, she could read the raised letters in the casting. Round Oak, Dowagiac, Michigan. A good stove, the kind that country schools and country churches ran on for half a century, built to take cordwood or coal and throw heat into a room with a 12-foot ceiling. The flue pipe was the problem. Where it ran up to the ceiling thimble, it had rusted to lace, and a stove with a bad flue is not a heater. It is a way to fill a sealed room with carbon monoxide and never wake up. She knew that much. She had a grandmother who had laid these fires. A retired carpenter named Sully came out the second day, sent by Merle without being asked, the way these things happen in that country. He was in his 70s, slow-moving, with a tape measure clipped to his belt and an unhurried way of looking at a problem before he touched it. He walked around the stove twice. He put a screwdriver into the flue pipe, and the metal gave like wet cardboard. "That's done," he said, which was the whole of his diagnosis. They drove to the hardware store in Westbrook and bought 12 feet of new single-wall stovepipe and a new thimble collar and a can of stove black. And Sully showed her how to crimp the sections and seat the joints and run a bead of furnace cement around the collar where it entered the ceiling. It took most of a day. When they lit the first fire that evening, kindling laid the night before the way Ingrid had taught her, it caught on the second match, and the draught pulled true, and the iron belly ticked and groaned as it heated, and the cold went out of the room for the first time in 30 years. She slept in the schoolhouse that night on a cot by the stove, in a sleeping bag, with the wind coming around the eaves and the new fire banked low, and she lay awake a long time, listening to the building settle and tick. In the morning there was frost on the inside of the south windows and a meadowlark somewhere out in the grey stubble, and she made coffee on a camp stove and drank it sitting on the recitation bench, facing the empty desks, and she felt, for the first time since February, that she was in the right place, doing the right thing, even though she could not have told you what the thing was. The floor came next. The board floor was tongue and groove pine, soft in places, and she meant only to find the soft spots and brace them from below before the winter set in hard. She was on her knees at the front of the room, by the platform where the teacher's desk stood, when she found the panel. It did not look like anything at first, a square of floorboard about 18 inches on a side, set into the platform decking, the grain running crosswise to the boards around it. She would not have noticed it at all, except that one corner had lifted a 1/16 of an inch, just enough to catch the edge of her hand, and when she pressed it, the whole square gave with the specific small movement of a thing that has been opened and closed many times over many years, and then closed for the last time. She worked it up with a flat bar, slowly, prying along each edge so as not to split the old wood, and when it came free, it lifted clean, hinged on a pair of small brass butt hinges screwed to the underside, hinges that someone had set there on purpose so that the panel would lift and not have to be pried at all. Whoever made it had wanted it found. Whoever closed it had wanted it kept. Underneath was a cavity perhaps 10 inches deep, framed between the floor joists and lined with a piece of oilcloth gone dark and brittle with age. And inside the oilcloth, wrapped in a second layer of waxed paper, were two things. The first was a leather-bound book. It was heavy, the leather dry but whole, the corners reinforced with cloth tape that someone had applied by hand a long time ago, the way you reinforce a thing you intend to use for years. The second was an envelope, plain, yellowed, the flap sealed and the seal still holding, and across the front, in a careful upright hand, in ink gone brown, were 4 words. To whoever finds this. Nora did not open the envelope right away. I have thought about why, and I think it is because she understood. kneeling there on the cold floor with the November light coming grey through the broken panes, that the book was the public thing and the letter was the private thing, and that you read the public thing first, the way you read the deed before you read the will. She lifted the book out and set it on the recitation bench and opened it under the window where the light was best. And what she had was the enrollment register of District 47, kept in a single hand at the start and then in a succession of hands across the years, beginning in the autumn of 1888 and ending in the spring of 1949. 312 names. Every child who had ever been enrolled in that building across 61 years, written one after another, with a column for the date enrolled and a column for the date left, and a column, the one that stopped her, for the reason. Moved to Wyndham, moved to Iowa, withdrawn for the harvest, fall of 1903. Withdrawn, family removed to the city, 1922. And here and there, in the reason column, a single word that the teacher had not softened because there was no softening it, and which appears in that register 11 times across 61 years. Died. I have read this register. I want to be careful here because it would be easy to make it more than it was, and what it was is already enough. It is not a diary. The teachers who kept it were not writing for us. They were keeping an account, the way the elevator man down at the siding kept an account of grain in and grain out, the way Merle Albu has kept the county's account of who owns what for 34 years. But an account kept faithfully for 61 years becomes something else without meaning to. It becomes the only record that a particular 8-year-old was ever in a particular room on a particular cold morning, learning her letters before the influenza took her in the spring. The hand changes in the register in 1936. Before that, several hands, some neat, some laboured. From the autumn of 1936, the entries are all in the same careful upright hand, the same hand as the 4 words on the envelope, and they continue in that hand without a break until the spring of 1949, 13 years, and then they stop. That was Iris Lundgren. She kept the register for the last 13 years of the school's life, and she was the one who lifted the panel in the floor and lined it with oilcloth and laid the book inside and wrapped a letter and sealed it and closed the panel down on both of them in the spring of 49, when the school went quiet for the last time and she walked out the east door and did not come back. Merle told Nora about her the following week at the cafe in Westbrook over the thermos. He had not known her himself, not really. He had been a boy when she stopped teaching, but he had spent 34 years among the county's paper, and he knew how to find a person in it. Iris Lundgren had come to District 47 in 1936 at the age of 20, with a 2-year certificate from the Teachers' College at Mankato. She had boarded with the Sorbo family on the next section over, and she had taught in that room for 13 years, through the worst of the drought and the dust and the war years, when the older boys went away and some of them did not come back. She had never married. When the school consolidated, she was 46, too old, the county decided, to be retrained for the new graded schools, and she lived out her life in a small house in Wyndham and died in 1971, and there was almost no one left to say what kind of teacher she had been. Almost no one. But there was one. There's a woman in the home in Wyndham, Merle said, turning his cup. Ada Sorbo. She's 81. She was a Sorbo, the family Iris boarded with, and she was a pupil in that school, little, in the 30s. She's the last one I know of who sat in that room with Iris Lundgren at the front of it. He looked at Nora. You found that book under the floor. I think Ada ought to be the one to tell you what's in it. Some of it. The part that isn't names and dates. The community came the way Prairie communities come, not all at once, not with announcement, but one at a time, with practical hands. A woman named May, who ran the cafe, started leaving a foil-covered plate on the schoolhouse step on Friday afternoons. Hot dish, scalloped potatoes, and would not take money for it, only the empty pan back. A man named Buddy, who farmed the section to the south, pulled his tractor over one morning and offered, without preamble, to drag the dead box elder windbreak out with a chain so the building could be seen from the road again, and did it that afternoon and took nothing for it. Petra, who worked at the county library in Wyndham, drove out with a box of cotton gloves and acid-free folders and a gentle, careful insistence that the register not be handled with bare hands again, not by anyone, because the oils in skin are what destroy old paper. And she was right, and Nora has worn the gloves ever since. And one cold Saturday in early December, with a storm forecast off the Dakotas that the radio said would close the roads by evening, Nora drove the 17 miles to the care home in Wyndham to meet Ada Sorbo, with the register wrapped in a clean cotton sheet on the passenger seat beside her, because she had decided that the book should go to the old woman rather than asking the old woman to come to the book. Ada Sorbo was small and bird-boned and entirely present, sharp behind her glasses, in a chair by a window that looked out on a parking lot, and beyond it, the flat white country going grey under the coming storm. She put her hand on the leather cover when Nora set the book in her lap, and she was quiet for a long moment, and then she opened it, not at the beginning, but somewhere she seemed to know, near the middle, in the spring of 1936, and she ran one finger down the page and stopped it on a name, and outside the window the first snow of the storm came slanting down across the parking lot, and Ada Sorbo said, "There, that's the one you'll want to ask me about. Selma Auner. She was 8. The page Ada Sorbo had her finger on was the spring of 1936, and I have since read it many times, and I can set it down for you the way it is written, because it is short, and because the shortness is the point. Spring term 1936, enrolled 42, average daily attendance 31, coal delivered for the stove 2.5 tons, charged to the district at $4.75 the ton. And then, in the reason column, against 3 names in that one spring, died, influenza. And one of the 3 names was Selma Auner, age 8, enrolled the autumn of 1934, withdrawn the 9th of March 1936. That is the whole of it in the book. 42 enrolled, 31 in attendance, 2.5 tons of coal, 3 children dead in one spring of a sickness that came through the drought-poor farms of that county like wind through a broken window. The register does not say more. The register was not built to say more. But Ada Sorbo was 6 years old in that room in the spring of 1936, and Ada Sorbo remembered, and this is what she told Nora while the storm closed the roads outside, and a nurse came twice to the door and went away again seeing that nothing was wrong. The Auners farmed the quarter section that the schoolhouse stood on. It was Auner land donated for the school in 1888, the same Auner name that ran down through the easement to Nora's grandmother and finally to Nora herself, though Nora did not know that yet, sitting in the care home. The winter of 1935 into 36 was the hard one, the one the old people in that country still measured other winters against. 40 below, and the snow over the fence lines, and the dust from the dry summer frozen into the drifts, so the snow came up grey. The influenza came in February. It went through the Auner house and took the mother first, and then, within the same week, the 2 youngest. And Selma was one of the 2 youngest, and she was 8. Iris Lundgren was 20 years old that winter. She had been teaching for 4 months. She boarded with the Sorbos, Ada's family, and walked the half-mile to the school every morning in the dark to lay the fire so the room would be warm when the children came. When the influenza came through, the county had no nurse closer than Wyndham, and the roads were shut for days at a stretch. And what Ada Sorbo remembered, 75 years later, with her finger on the name in the book, was this: that Iris Lundgren, 20 years old, 4 months into her first job, kept teaching. That she came every morning and laid the fire. That when the Auner children who were left, the older ones, came to school hollow-eyed and silent in the weeks after, having lost a mother and a brother and a sister in a single February, Iris fed them out of her own lunch pail, quietly, without making a thing of it, a sandwich split in 2 under the desk, so that the other children would not see and the Auner children would not be shamed. That she did this every day for the rest of that